They walked into the glass office wearing silk and smelling of expensive brandy, acting as if they had built the mountain themselves. They were celebrating a $15 million fortune, completely blind to the fact that they were standing on a foundation of lies. I'm Madeline Fox, and as I watched my parents laugh about selling our heritage, I couldn't help but remember the cold indifference in their eyes when they told me I was only good enough for the worthless shack. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spend here with us. But the truth is, like a diamond, it's hard, sharp, and eventually it cuts through everything. There is a specific sound a rock hammer makes when it strikes true against granite. It isn't a thud. It is a sharp singing clink that echoes inside your chest. To me, that sound is the heartbeat of the world. I've spent the last 10 years of my life listening to the ground beneath my feet, while other women my age were building careers in glass office towers or worrying about the social hierarchy of the city. I was here knee-deep in the dirt of the Absaroka Range. I am a geologist. I don't look at a cliff face and see a pretty view for a postcard. I see strata. I see pressure. I see millions of years of violence and patience pressed into stone. My name is Madeline Fox, and if there is one thing I have learned from the rocks, it is that the truth is always buried deep. You just have to know where to dig. Some people look at a mountain and see scenery. My parents looked at this valley, our family's legacy, and saw a bank vault they didn't have the combination to. They spent 40 years kicking the dirt, cursing their bad luck, never realizing that I was the only one who knew where the key was hidden. I'm sitting in my cottage right now. It's a small, rugged structure built from rough-hewn timber by my grandfather's own hands 60 years ago. It smells like cedar wood smoke and the sharp, dry scent of old paper. My desk isn't made of mahogany. It's a slab of pine covered in Mylar mapped soil samples in labeled jars and a brass microscope that looks like it belongs in a museum. To the outside world, I suppose I look like a failure. A woman in her late 20s living alone in a cabin wearing boots that have seen more miles than most cars. But I am not a squatter here. I own this cottage, and more importantly, I understand what lies beneath it. But silence is a heavy thing to carry, especially when you know a storm is coming. That storm started 3 months ago. It was a Tuesday. I remember the day clearly because the air had that biting chill that comes down from the peaks in late autumn. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. I heard them before I saw them. The sound of an engine too smooth, too quiet for these rough roads, hummed up the driveway. I wiped the soil from my hands and stepped out onto the porch. A sleek black sedan pulled up, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel. It was a leased car. I knew that immediately. My parents, Robert and Elena, never bought anything outright if they could rent the appearance of wealth instead. They stepped out, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of pine trees and gray stone. My mother was wearing heels that sank into the soft earth. My father was adjusting a silk tie, looking at the surrounding hills with a mixture of hunger and disdain. "Madeline," my father said. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't ask how I was. He just nodded at the cottage as if it were a stain on his shirt. "Still living like a pioneer, I see." "Hello, Dad." "Mom." I stayed on the porch leaning against the railing. "You didn't call." "We didn't need to," my mother said, brushing invisible dust from her coat. "We have news, big news." She was smiling, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a shark gives before it takes a bite. My father walked up the steps, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. He slapped it against his palm. The sound was dry and final. "We've done it, Maddie," he said, his voice trembling with a greed he couldn't hide. We finally found a buyer. Global Apex Mining. They've been surveying the region for months. My stomach turned over. Buyer. You can't sell the land. Grandfather's will was specific. The 500 acres stay in the family. The will said the land stays with the Fox family. My father corrected, a smug look settling in his eyes. I am the head of this family, and I say we sell. They offered $15 million, Madeline. 15 million. He said the number, slowly tasting every syllable. It's strip mining, Dad, I said, my voice rising. Global Apex tears mountains down to the bedrock. They'll destroy everything: the creek, the timber, the history. It's dirt, my mother snapped, losing her composure. It is useless, rocky dirt that has never given us a dime. We are drowning in debt, Madeline. We have mortgages, loans. This is our way out. We deserve this. You deserve to sell grandfather's legacy because you spent money you didn't have, I asked quietly. My father's face hardened. The mask of the jovial businessman slipped, revealing the cruelty underneath. You were always too sentimental. You think small. That's why we didn't include you in the negotiations. You would have just complicated the deal with your talk of conservation and rocks. We cut you out for your own good, my mother added, her tone sickly sweet. But don't worry, we aren't heartless. Read the deed. She gestured to the paper in my father's hand. We kept the cottage out of the sale, my father said, waving the document. The 2 acres this shack sits on, it's yours, deeded specifically to you, just like the old man wanted. We're only selling the useless land around it. You get to keep your little hermitage. We get the fortune. I looked at them, really looked at them. I saw the desperation behind their arrogance. They viewed this land as a checkbook. They viewed me as an obstacle to be managed. You're making a mistake, I said. The only mistake would be walking away from $15 million. My father laughed. The closing meeting is in 3 months. Don't cause a scene, Madeline. Just stay here and play with your rocks. They turned around, got back in their leased car, and drove away. They left me standing in the cold, listening to the silence returning to the valley. That was 3 months ago. Today the silence ended. I looked down at the letter resting on my desk. It arrived this morning via courier. The envelope was thick, creamy paper with the embossed logo of Global Apex Mining. It was a summons to the surveyor's office in the city. The final survey was complete. The contracts were drawn. They were ready to break ground. My parents thought I was staying here to lick my wounds. They thought I was hiding in my cottage, crying over my lost inheritance. They were wrong. I stood up and walked to the corner of the room, grabbing my heavy leather satchel. I didn't pack tissues. I didn't pack a lawyer's note. I packed my field journals. I packed 3 specific core samples I had drilled myself years ago before my parents ever looked at a mining contract. I packed the geological map I had drawn by hand, tracing the fault lines that the satellites had missed. I ran my thumb over the brass buckle of the bag. It felt cold and solid. My parents were going to that meeting to argue about money. They were going to sign away the land for a life of luxury they hadn't earned. But I wasn't going there to argue emotions. I wasn't going to beg for their mercy or appeal to their sense of family duty. I was going to argue science. I put on my coat, picked up the satchel, and walked out the door. The wind was still whistling through the canyon, the same song it had sung for 1,000 years. It sounded like a warning. I just hoped, for their sake, my parents were finally ready to listen. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. In the comments, your own story might inspire our future episodes. The surveyor's office was a glass box in the center of the city. It smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. The air conditioning hummed with a low, artificial drone that seemed to suck the moisture right out of your skin. It was a far cry from the clean pine-scented air of the valley, and I felt immediately out of place. I sat in a leather chair that cost more than my first truck. I was wearing my best clean flannel shirt and dark jeans, but my boots were scuffed at the toes. I hadn't bothered to polish them. They were working boots, and I was here to work. My parents, on the other hand, looked like they were attending a coronation. My father, Robert, was wearing a suit that was too tight across the shoulders. It was a shiny, electric blue fabric that caught the fluorescent lights in a way that made my eyes hurt. My mother, Elena, was draped in a fur stole, despite it being 60 degrees outside. She was nervous. I could tell by the way she kept touching her neck, checking to make sure her pearls were still there. They were drunk. Not on alcohol, though. I smelled a hint of brandy on my father's breath, but on the promise of wealth. They were drunk on the idea of being rich. Madeline, my father said, leaning back in his chair and putting his feet up on the rung of the table. You look rustic. I came straight from the site, Dad, I said quietly. Of course you did, my mother chimed in. She didn't look at me. She was busy examining her reflection in the dark glass of the window. Always digging, always dirty. You know, with the money coming in, we could hire you a stylist. Fix you up. Maybe then you'd find a husband who could get you out of that shack. I didn't take the bait. I just watched them. Across the table sat Mr. Henderson, the regional executive for Global Apex Mining. He was a sharp man with eyes like flint. He had been checking his watch every 30 seconds since we arrived. He clearly had better places to be than babysitting a family dispute. Click, click, click. He was pressing the top of his ballpoint pen over and over again. It was a rhythmic, impatient sound that echoed in the silent room. My parents didn't hear it. They were too busy spending money they didn't have yet. I was thinking a boat, my father said to the room at large. A catamaran. We can dock it in Florida, get away from these winters. And the debts, Robert? I asked. I kept my voice level. The $12,000 in back taxes on the estate, the liens against the equipment. My father waved his hand dismissively. Pocket change, Maddie. Once this deal is signed, that's all just clerical errors. We'll be liquid. We'll be untouchable. He laughed, but it was a brittle sound. I saw the sweat beading on his upper lip. They weren't just greedy. They were terrified. They had leveraged everything on this sale. If it fell through, they wouldn't just be poor. They would be destitute. They would lose the status they cherished more than their own daughter. Mr. Henderson stopped clicking his pen. He opened a thick folder on the mahogany table. Mr. and Mrs. Fox. Henderson said, his voice smooth and cold. The final survey reports have been processed. Our legal team has drawn up the transfer of the deed for the 500 acres surrounding the central homestead. Excellent, my father said, rubbing his hands together. Where do we sign? In a moment, Henderson said. He looked at me for the first time. I understand your daughter is also a resident on the property. She's just a tenant, my mother said quickly, her voice shrill. She has the cottage as per the grandfather's will, but she has no claim to the commercial land. She's just there, playing in the dirt while the adults do business. Playing in the dirt. I felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp, but I pushed it down. They had no idea. They looked at me and saw a child playing with rocks. They didn't realize that while they were shopping for boats, I had been reading the earth. I sat back in the leather chair and folded my hands over my stomach. I didn't speak. Not yet. They didn't know where I had been yesterday. The memory of yesterday washed over me, drowning out the hum of the office air conditioner. It had been raining, a cold, miserable drizzle that turned the clay roads into slick grease. I had driven my truck out to the western ridge, the highest point of the property. I wasn't alone. Waiting for me leaning against a muddy pickup truck was Silas. Silas was the foreman for the Global Apex Survey crew. He was a man cut from the same cloth as the mountains, weathered gray and immovable. He didn't care about stock prices or corporate mergers. He cared about load-bearing ratios and density reports. I parked and stepped out into the rain. I was holding a heavy canvas bag. "Ms. Fox?" Silas grunted, tipping the brim of his hard hat. "You said you had something that couldn't wait?" "I do, Silas," I said. "I wanted to show you something before your bosses sign the check tomorrow." He crossed his arms over his chest. He looked skeptical. "I've seen the satellite data, ma'am. The boys in the city ran the thermal scans. We know where the vein is. It runs right up the gut of the valley, north to south." "That's what the satellite says." I agreed. Satellites are great at seeing the surface. They aren't so good at seeing the shifts. I walked over to the tailgate of his truck and dropped the canvas bag. It landed with a heavy thud. I unbuckled it and pulled out 3 cylinders of rock. They were core samples, drilled cylinders of stone that showed the layers of the earth like rings on a tree. "I drilled these myself," I said, "3 years ago. Look at the second one." Silas walked over. He wiped the rain from his eyes and peered at the stone. He was a professional. He knew what he was looking at. "Kimberlite," he muttered. "Blue ground, that's diamond-bearing rock." "Look at the angle of the strata, Silas," I said, pointing to a thin gray line running through the sample. "It's tilted, 45 degrees. He frowned. He picked up the rock, feeling the weight of it. "If the strata is tilted that sharply—" "Then there was a fault shift," I finished for him. "A massive one, probably 10,000 years ago. The satellite data assumed the vein continued straight, but the fault snapped it." I pulled out a map. It wasn't a glossy computer printout. It was hand-drawn on waterproof vellum, inked with the precision of someone who had walked every inch of those 500 acres. I traced a line with my finger. "The vein doesn't run north," I said. "The fault pushed it vertical. It's a pipe, Silas, a concentrated vertical pipe of diamond-rich ore." Silas looked at the map, then back at the core sample. His eyes widened slightly. It was the only sign of surprise he gave. "And where does the pipe surface?" he asked. I didn't say a word. I just pointed to the small red square in the center of the map, the square that marked my cottage. Silas went quiet. The rain drummed against the metal roof of his truck. He looked out at the valley, then back at the map. He did the mental math. He realized that the 500 acres his company was about to buy for $15 million was nothing but granite and slate. The treasure wasn't in the yard. It was under the house. He let out a low whistle. "Your parents don't know," he stated. It wasn't a question. "My parents don't care," I corrected. "They never asked. They just assumed the land was a uniform commodity, like selling wheat." Silas looked at me with a new respect. He saw the dirt under my fingernails. He saw the calluses on my palms. He realized I wasn't just the landowner's daughter. I was the one who did the work. "Why show me?" Silas asked. "You could have let us dig. We would have figured it out eventually." "Because I know how corporate contracts work," I said. "If I wait until after they sign, it's a mess. Lawsuits, injunctions. They'll tie me up in court for 20 years trying to claim eminent domain. I need this stopped before the ink dries. I need the truth on the table." Silas nodded slowly. He understood honor, and he understood that sending a mining crew to dig a hole in the wrong place was a waste of a good man's time. He extended a hand. It was the size of a catcher's mitt and rough as sandpaper. "I'll be at the meeting tomorrow," Silas said. "Mr. Henderson likes to have me there to nod and look reassuring about the timeline." "If I speak up," I asked, taking his hand, "will you back the science?" "I don't lie about rock, Ms. Fox," Silas said. "If you put the proof on the table, I'll verify it." The memory faded and I was back in the sterile, cold conference room. Mr. Henderson was sliding a thick stack of papers across the table toward my parents. The X for the signature was marked with a yellow sticky note. "Standard liability clauses," Henderson droned on. "Mineral rights transfer, access roads, it's all boilerplate." My mother reached for the pen. Her hand was shaking just a little. She was looking at the paper like it was a life raft and she was drowning in the middle of the ocean. "Finally," she whispered, "finally we can breathe." My father laughed, a nervous barking sound. "Just sign it, Elena. Let's get the check." I looked at Silas. He was standing in the corner of the room, arms crossed, leaning against the wall. He was wearing his clean work uniform, his hard hat resting on the chair beside him. He caught my eye. He gave a barely perceptible nod. It was time. I sat up straighter in my chair. The leather creaked. "Wait," I said. The word wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a crack in a windshield. My father froze. The pen hovered inches above the paper. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes narrowing. "Madeline," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Not now." "Yes, now," I said. I reached down and lifted my heavy leather satchel onto the table. It made a solid, heavy sound that made the coffee cups rattle. "You need to put the pen down, Dad." "Excuse me," Mr. Henderson said, looking annoyed. "Ms. Fox, this closing is between the property owners and Global Apex. You are here as a courtesy." "I am here," I said, unbuckling the satchel, "because you are about to spend $15 million on a pile of worthless rocks." "Madeline," my mother shrieked, "stop it. Stop it right now. You are just jealous because we didn't give you a cut." "I don't want your money, Mom," I said calmly. I pulled out the first core sample and set it on the mahogany table. "I just don't want you to commit fraud." "Fraud?" My father stood up, his face turning a blotchy red. "How dare you? I am your father. I have supported you. You have ignored the land." I cut him off. My voice was steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. "And because you ignored it, you don't know what you're selling." I looked at Mr. Henderson. The annoyance on his face was fading, replaced by a flicker of professional curiosity. He looked at the core sample on the table. "What is this?" Henderson asked. "That," I said, "is the truth. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes." "The truth." My father looked at the cylinder of rock standing on the polished mahogany table. He looked at it like it was a dead rat I had dragged in from the barn. "Madeline," he said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating growl, "take your rock, take your bag, and get out. You are embarrassing us in front of Mr. Henderson." "I'm not leaving, Dad," I said. My voice was steady, but my hands were trembling slightly. I clasped them behind my back so they wouldn't see. "Not until Mr. Henderson understands what he is actually buying." "He is buying the land," my mother snapped. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. The sound was like a shriek in the quiet room. The land that belongs to us. You have no rights here, Madeline. Grandfather left you the cottage because he knew you couldn't make it on your own. He did it out of pity. The word hung in the air. Pity. It stung sharp and cold, but I didn't flinch. I looked at my mother, seeing the fear behind her rage. She was terrified that the illusion of her wealthy life was about to shatter. He left me the cottage because he knew I would stay, I said softly. He knew I would protect it. Protect it. My father laughed a cruel barking sound. You're living like a hermit in a shack. You're almost 30 years old, Madeline. You have nothing. No husband, no career, no legacy. And now you're trying to sabotage the only success this family has ever had because you're jealous. Robert, please, Mr. Henderson interrupted. He wasn't looking at my parents. He was looking at the rock sample. He reached out and picked it up, feeling the weight of it. He ran his thumb over the gray streak of the fault line. Let her speak. She's lying, my father shouted. He slammed his hand on the table. She's just a girl playing with a rock hammer. She doesn't know anything about commercial mining. I am a certified geologist, I said, my voice rising to match his volume. I have spent 10 years mapping every inch of that valley, and I am telling you, you are selling them the wrong dirt. My father moved toward me. For a second, I thought he might actually grab me. His face was flushed, the veins in his neck bulging against his tight collar. You ungrateful, selfish child, he hissed. We are walking out of here with $15 million, and you are going to go back to your little hovel and rot. That's enough. Mr. Henderson's voice cracked like a whip. My father stopped. He blinked, looking confused as if he had forgotten there were other people in the room. Sit down, Robert, Henderson commanded. He turned his cold, flinty eyes toward me. Miss Fox, you made a claim. You said the survey's wrong. Prove it. I took a deep breath. This was it. The moment I had prepared for. The moment the rocks had whispered to me about for years. I reached into my leather satchel. I bypassed the other samples and pulled out the map. It was a large roll of heavy waterproof vellum. I untied the leather cord that bound it. Whoosh! I unrolled it across the table. The heavy paper flattened out, covering the glossy corporate contracts. It covered the signature lines. It covered the lies. This, I said, pointing to the intricate ink lines, is the Absaroka Valley. Mr. Henderson leaned in. The corporate attorney leaned in. Even my parents, despite their anger, couldn't help but look. Your satellite survey identified a kimberlite pipe running north to south, I began. I tapped a long blue line that ran through the center of the 500 acres my parents owned. That is what the thermal imaging saw, a density shift suggesting a massive diamond deposit. Correct, Henderson said suspiciously. That is our primary payload. And it would be, I said, if the Earth stood still, but it doesn't. I picked up a red marker from the tray on the table. 10,000 years ago, there was a seismic event here, I said, drawing a sharp, jagged line across the blue vein. A transverse fault. It didn't just shake the ground, Mr. Henderson. It sheared it. I looked up at him. Imagine a straw in a glass of water, I said. If you break the glass and shift the top half, the straw doesn't line up anymore. That is what happened to your diamond vein. I moved my finger along the map. I traced the path of the fault line. The satellite data assumed the vein continued straight because the surface soil covers the fracture. But down deep, where the diamonds are, I shook my head. The vein didn't go north, I said. The pressure forced it vertical. It created a pressure pipe. Where? Henderson asked. His voice was a whisper now. The clicking of the pen had stopped completely. The room was dead silent. I looked at my parents. They were staring at the map, their mouths slightly open. They didn't understand the science, but they understood the tone. They knew something was wrong. You sold them 500 acres of land, I said to my father. You sold them the view. You sold them the timber. You sold them the surface. I turned back to Henderson. I placed my finger on a tiny small square drawn in the very center of the map. It was a small island of property surrounded by the sea of my parents' estate. The fault line shifts the vein 300 yards to the west, I said, directly under this parcel. I tapped the square. This is the kimberlite pipe, I said. It is a vertical column, roughly 4 acres wide, going down 2 miles deep. It is one of the richest deposits in the state. And who owns that parcel? The corporate attorney asked, adjusting his glasses. I looked him in the eye. I do. The silence that followed was heavy. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. That is my cottage, I said clearly. My grandfather deeded those 2 acres to me, specifically, explicitly, including all mineral and subsurface rights. I looked at my parents. You sold the donut, Dad, I said, but I own the whole. My father's face went pale. All the blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking gray and old. He looked at the map. He looked at the line I had drawn. He realized what I was saying. The 500 acres he was selling for $15 million were just granite and dirt, worthless for mining. The diamonds, the fortune, were sitting directly under the floorboards of the shack he had mocked 5 minutes ago. No, my mother whispered. No, that's not possible, the survey said. The survey was lazy, I said. Mr. Henderson stood up. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city skyline. He stayed there for a long moment, then he turned around. He didn't look at me. He looked at the man in the corner. Silas, Henderson asked. Silas stepped forward. He had been a statue this entire time, watching the drama unfold with a stoic expression. He picked up his hard hat. She's right, boss, Silas said. His voice was rough like gravel tumbling in a mixer. You verified this? Henderson asked. This morning? Silas nodded. Ms. Fox showed me the core samples yesterday. I didn't believe her at first. So I took a crew out at dawn. We drilled 2 test bores on the main property. Dust, shale, nothing but garden rocks. Silas walked over to the table and tapped the square where my cottage sat. Then we drilled 1 test bore just inside her fence line, Silas said. We hit the pipe at 50 feet. High-grade ore. The payload is massive. Silas looked at my father, his eyes narrowing with a lack of respect that was painful to witness. The main plot is dirt, Silas said, flatly. The diamonds are under the girl's house. Mr. Henderson walked back to the table. He looked at the contract. He looked at the signature line where my mother's hand had been hovering just minutes ago. He picked up the contract. Rip. He tore the document in half. The sound was loud, violent, and final. The deal is off, Henderson said. Wait. My father scrambled up. Wait, you can't do that. We have a verbal agreement, you promised. I promised to buy a diamond mine, Mr. Fox, Henderson said, his voice ice cold. You were trying to sell me a goat farm. That is misrepresentation. We didn't know, my mother wailed. She grabbed my father's arm. We didn't know. You have to believe us. Ignorance is not a defense when you are asking for $15 million, Henderson said. He dropped the torn pieces of paper onto the table. They fluttered down like dead leaves. He turned to me. The look in his eyes changed. The coldness vanished, replaced by a shark-like intent. He wasn't looking at a nuisance anymore. He was looking at a partner. Ms. Fox, Henderson said, extending a hand. It seems we have been negotiating with the wrong person. I looked at his hand. Then I looked at my parents. They were huddled together, looking small and terrified. The arrogance was gone. The cruelty was gone. All that was left was the crushing weight of reality. They had debts, they had mortgages, and the lottery ticket they thought they were holding had just turned into a scrap of paper. I didn't shake Henderson's hand. Not yet. I know what my land is worth, Mr. Henderson, I said, and I know what lies beneath it. But before we talk business, there are some family matters we need to settle. I looked at my father. You said I was a failure, I said quietly. You said I was nothing. But right now, I am the only thing standing between you and total ruin. My father looked down at his shoes. He couldn't meet my eyes. The silence in the room wasn't heavy anymore. It was loud. It was the sound of the tables turning. I turned back to the map, rolling it up slowly, deliberate, in every movement. Now, I said, let's talk about who really owns this valley. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb that has already gone off, leaving only the ringing in your ears. Mr. Henderson stared at the map on the table for a long time. Then he turned slowly toward my parents. The professional veneer was gone. His face was red, not with embarrassment, but with fury. You wasted my time, Henderson said. His voice was dangerously quiet. 6 months of surveys, legal fees, travel expenses, and you tried to sell me a quarry that doesn't even have gravel worth crushing. Mr. Henderson, please, my father stammered. He was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. It was an honest mistake. The satellite data. You thought you could cash a check before the ink was dry, Henderson snapped. He walked around the table, looming over my father. Do you know what gross misrepresentation means? Mr. Fox, it means fraud. It means breach of contract. He pointed a finger at my father's chest. We advanced you $500,000 against the final sale price, Henderson said, to cover your immediate liquidity issues, as you called them. Where is that money? My mother let out a small, strangled sob. She covered her mouth with her hand. It's invested, my father lied, but his eyes darted around the room, betraying him. It's gone, I said. They both looked at me. They bought the boat, Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice flat. They paid off the lease on the car. They settled the country club dues. The money is spent. My father looked at me with pure hatred, but underneath it, there was panic. He knew I was right. Then I will see you in court, Henderson said. He turned to his attorney. File the suit tomorrow. I want the advance returned immediately, plus damages. I want a lien on every asset they own. The house, the cars, the land, everything. No. My mother grabbed Henderson's sleeve. He pulled away as if she were contagious. Please, we'll be ruined. We have nothing else. If you sue us, we'll lose the estate. We'll be on the street. That is not my problem, Mrs. Fox, Henderson said coldly. You played a game you didn't understand, and you lost. He started to pack up his briefcase. The click of the latches sounded like gunshots. My parents stood there frozen. The reality of their situation was crashing down on them. They weren't just losing $15 million. They were facing bankruptcy. They were facing public humiliation. The friends they tried so hard to impress would read about the lawsuit in the papers. They would be pariahs. Then slowly they turned to look at me. The anger in their eyes was gone. The arrogance that had defined them for my entire life evaporated, leaving behind something pathetic. They looked small. They looked old. "Maddie," my mother whispered. Her voice was trembling. "Maddie, you can't let them do this." "I didn't do anything, Mom," I said. "You did this to yourselves." "But you have the rights," my father said. He took a step toward me, his hands open in a pleading gesture. "The diamonds are under your cottage. You can still make the deal. If you sign with them, if you include us." "Include you?" I asked. I felt a bitter laugh rising in my throat. "You wanted to sell the land out from under me. You told me I was a failure. You told me I was nothing. And now you want me to use my inheritance to save you." "We're family," my mother cried. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. "We're your parents. You owe us." "I owe you respect," I said. "I don't owe you my dignity." I looked at them, really looked at them. I saw the fear, but I also saw the selfishness. Even now, begging for their lives, they were talking about what I owed them. They didn't care about the land. They didn't care about me. They only cared that the checkbook was closing. I turned away from them. I couldn't look at it anymore. "Mr. Henderson," Silas spoke up. The foreman stepped away from the wall. He had been watching the scene with a grim expression, his arms crossed over his chest. He walked over to the table and looked at the map I had drawn. "The girl is right about the family," Silas said. "They're a bad investment, but the rock doesn't care who owns it." Silas looked at me, then at Henderson. "The pipe is real, boss," Silas said. "I've seen the core. It's the richest deposit I've seen in 20 years. If you walk away now because of these two," he jerked a thumb at my parents, "someone else is going to come along and drill it. Rio Tinto, De Beers, someone will pick this up." Henderson paused. He looked at Silas. He trusted his foreman more than he trusted any lawyer. "So, what do you suggest?" Henderson asked. "Cut out the dead weight," Silas said. He turned to me. "Ms. Fox isn't a liability," Silas said. "She's the only one in this room who actually knows what the hell she's doing. She found the vein. She mapped the fault. She owns the deed." Silas looked me in the eye. "Make the deal with her," Silas said. "Direct. Leave the parents out of it. They don't own the mineral rights anyway." Henderson looked at me. He evaluated me. He saw the work boots. He saw the steady hands. He saw the map. For the first time, he didn't see a girl. He saw a geologist. "He's right," Henderson said. "The company wants the stones. We don't care whose name is on the check." He pulled a fresh contract from his briefcase. He set it on the table, pushing aside the torn pieces of the old one. "Ms. Fox," Henderson said, "I can offer you a standard lease agreement, 7% royalties on all extracted minerals, a signing bonus, and full reclamation rights once the mining is complete." He uncapped his pen and held it out to me. "We can have the paperwork redrawn in an hour," Henderson said. "Just you and Global Apex. Your parents get nothing. They face the lawsuit alone." I looked at the pen. It was a heavy, expensive instrument. I looked at my parents. They were holding their breath. They looked like ghosts. They knew that if I took that pen, their lives were over. They would lose everything. The house, the cars, their reputation. My father's lip quivered. "Maddie, please." It was the first time in my life I had ever heard him beg. I looked at Silas. He gave me a small nod. He wasn't telling me what to do. He was just telling me that the power was finally, undeniably in my hands. I reached out and took the pen. The metal was cold against my skin. I looked down at the contract. It was freedom. It was vindication. It was everything they had told me I would never have. I could sign it. I could walk away, rich. I could watch them burn in the fire they had started. It would be justice. It would be fair. But then I thought about the cottage. I thought about the way the light hit the valley floor in the morning. I thought about my grandfather who had built that house with his own hands, not for money but for shelter. I looked at my parents one last time. They weren't monsters. They were just weak, greedy people who had forgotten what really mattered. If I destroyed them, would I be any better? I took a deep breath. The air in the room still smelled like stale coffee and fear. "I'll sign," I said. My parents let out a gasp of relief. "But," I added, my voice hard as granite, "there are conditions." Don't be shy to share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire our future episodes. Conditions. Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow. He tapped the polished table with his index finger. "Ms. Fox, you are sitting on a diamond pipe worth potentially hundreds of millions over its lifespan. You are in a position to dictate terms. But I'm curious. What conditions do you have for us?" "Not for you," I said, keeping my voice low. "For them." I pointed the heavy pen at my parents. They flinched as if the pen were a weapon. They were huddled together in the leather chairs, looking less like the arrogant socialites who had arrived this morning and more like two people waiting for a sentencing hearing. "Mr. Henderson," I said, turning back to the executive. "Clause 4B, regarding the signing bonus and initial royalty advance." Henderson flipped through the pages. "Yes, it's substantial." "I want you to amend it," I said. "I want you to deduct $500,000 from my initial payment." Henderson paused. He looked at me confused. "You want to lower your own payout?" "I want you to take that $500,000, I said clearly, "and apply it to the debt owed to Global Apex by Robert and Elena Fox. I am paying back their advance, today, in full." My mother let out a gasp. It was a wet, ragged sound. She looked at me with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. "Maddie," she whispered, you would do that." "I'm not finished," I said, cutting her off. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the corporate attorney. "That settles their debt to you. They walk away with a zero balance. No lawsuit, no bankruptcy, no public humiliation." "Agreed," Henderson said. He signaled the lawyer, who began typing furiously on a laptop. "It's irregular but acceptable. We get our money back. And the second condition," I turned to my parents. "This one requires your signature," I said to them. I reached into my satchel and pulled out a notepad. I hadn't prepared a legal document, but I knew enough about property law to write a binding letter of intent. "You wanted to sell the land," I said. "You viewed the 500 acres as a burden, a cash cow you couldn't milk." My father stared at his hands. He didn't argue. The fight had gone out of him. "You get to keep the house," I said. "You get to keep the cars. You get to keep your standing at the country club. No one needs to know you almost lost it all." I pushed the notepad toward them. "But in exchange," I said, my voice hardening, "you are transferring the deed of the remaining 500 acres into a land trust." "A trust?" my father asked, his voice hoarse. "Managed by me," I said. "The trust will have a perpetual conservation easement. That means the land can never be subdivided, it can never be developed, and it can never ever be sold." I leaned in closer. "You can live there for the rest of your lives," I told them. "You can walk the woods. You can enjoy the view. but you will never hold the power to destroy it again. You are guests on the land now, not masters. My father looked at the notepad. He looked at the heavy corporate contract Henderson was holding, the one that would save him from financial ruin. He realized the trade he was making. He was trading his greed for his safety. He was trading his ownership for his dignity. He looked at me. For the first time in 20 years, I didn't see disappointment in his eyes. I saw shame. We accept, my father whispered. The lawyer printed the addendum. The scratching of pens on paper filled the room. It was the sound of a cage door closing, but it was also the sound of a shelter being built. They signed. I signed. Mr. Henderson shook my hand. We'll have the equipment on site in 2 weeks, Ms. Fox. Talk to Silas, I said, nodding at the foreman. He knows where to dig. I picked up my satchel. I didn't wait for my parents. I didn't wait for a thank you that I knew they didn't know how to give. I walked out of the glass box past the secretaries and into the elevator. Silas followed me. We rode down in silence. When the doors opened to the lobby, Silas tipped his hard hat. You're a good woman, Madeline, he grunted. Better than most. I just wanted to go home, Silas, I said. I drove home in the dark. The headlights of my truck cut through the blackness of the canyon, illuminating the pines and the sheer rock faces that lined the road. I pulled up to the cottage. The air was cold and clean. I stepped out and stood on the porch listening. The wind was still whistling through the valley. The crickets were singing their rhythmic, endless song. It was the same sound I had heard yesterday and the day before that. The land didn't know about the contracts. It didn't know about the millions of dollars or the lawsuits. It just was. I sat down on the wooden steps and looked up at the stars. I could have destroyed them. The thought drifted through my mind like smoke. It would have been so easy. I could have signed the deal, taken the money, and let the lawsuit crush them. I could have watched them lose the big house, the cars, the status they worshipped. I could have tasted the sweetness of their regret. It would have been justice. They had treated me with cruelty for years. They had tried to sell my home out from under me. But then I thought about the geology of this place. I thought about how rocks break. When you apply too much pressure too fast, the stone shatters. It creates a landslide, and a landslide doesn't pick and choose what it destroys. It takes the trees, the soil, the animals. It buries everything in its path. If I had crushed my parents, I would have started a landslide. I would have had to live with the wreckage. I would have had to carry the weight of their ruin. I didn't want wreckage. I wanted peace. I paid their debt not because they deserved it. God knows they didn't, but because I refused to be like them. They measured their worth in what they could take from the world. I measured mine in what I could protect. They were safe now. They were humbled, yes, and stripped of their power to do harm, but they were safe. And the land, the 500 acres of granite and pine, was safe forever. I picked up a small stone from the step next to me. It was cold and rough. I squeezed it in my hand, feeling its solidity. Some battles aren't won by destroying the enemy. They are won by outlasting them, by remaining solid when everything else is shifting. I stood up and tossed the stone back into the yard. It landed with a soft thud in the dirt. I walked inside and closed the door. The latch clicked shut. It was a small sound, but it felt like the final period at the end of a very long sentence. Don't be shy to share your thoughts in the comments. Your own story might inspire our future episodes. Madeline chose dignity over destruction, securing her peace while saving her family. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice involving family betrayal? Don't be shy to share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.